The Cuban Missile Crisis by Grace Sloan and Maven Weinrod. The Cuban Missile Crisis was also known as the October Crisis, the Caribbean Crisis, and the Missile Scare, which took place when the Cold War was in full force. This 13-day confrontation was considered the closest the Cold War came to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war. The United States failed at an attempt to take over the islands that made up Cuba at the time in hopes to overthrow their communist government. As you can imagine, Cuba was fearful that it would not be strong enough if another attack happened, as their forces were very limited. So in precaution, Cuba secretly sought the help of the USSR and Russia. Nikita Khrushchev was a Russian politician who led Soviet Russia during part of the Cold War. With Cuba's cry for help, he decided to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, not only for protection purposes, but to counteract the United States' threats of missiles in Turkey and Italy, which were aimed at Russia and very close. A U.S. U-2 spy plane that happened to fly over Cuba witnessed the construction of the missiles and took pictures to bring back to President John F. Kennedy in the United States. Kennedy, being suspicious of these secretive weapons so close to the United States, called on officials to create the XCOM, or the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. XCOM provided the president with more great minds to try and figure out a way to deal with what was happening, especially considering that Cuban and Russian leaders both insisted the missiles were there for protective purposes, which was primarily true. On October 22nd, President John F. Kennedy announced that he would intercept all shipments to Cuba, which happened to include some of the missile parts being transported from Russia. JFK did this to prevent more nuclear weaponry pieces from reaching Cuba and being constructed into deadly missiles that could be targeted at the United States, who did not want to get involved from the beginning. JFK referred to it as a quarantine, so it wouldn't be considered an act of war, although Khrushchev and Cuban dictator Fidel Castro believed this naval blockade was the opposite. To encourage and get public support, Kennedy broadcasted the event on television and released many statements for the entire country to see regarding the events in order to gain more support. Hoping things could go back to normal, Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev stating that the U.S. would not allow weapons to be sent to Cuba and that all weaponry constructed on the island must be returned to the USSR. Khrushchev wrote a letter back describing the interception as an act of aggression and how what Kennedy was asking for was very unreasonable. Khrushchev also made a clear point about how interception was the same as a blockade, which he saw as an act of aggression and gave him a reason to presume this was an act of war. The second part of the letter demanded that the U.S. Jupiter missiles would also have to be removed from Turkey, as he saw these deadly weapons as a threat considering their proximity to Russia. Eventually, with consensus from the XCOM, President John F. Kennedy agreed not to invade Cuba, but only if the Soviets agreed to remove all the nuclear missiles. Kennedy ignored Khrushchev's letter and focused on keeping Russia under United States authority while the missiles were being removed and transported back. After some time contemplating how to handle Khrushchev's terms about removing the Jupiter missiles, Kennedy appointed his brother Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, or RFK, to meet with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to deliver a secretive message. RFK told of how the U.S. was going to remove the Jupiter missiles anyways, but did not want to issue a public statement, not only to citizens, but also NATO allies. This was a concession to the blackmail by Khrushchev. After the terms were settled, a telephone hotline was set up in 1963 to give constant contact between Khrushchev and Kennedy to prevent further instances such as this from taking place in the future. Later that same year, a peace treaty of sorts was signed to prevent further run-ins with nuclear warfare between Russia and the United States.